Okay, everyone, I think it's time we get started. So thank you for joining Indiegogo and Riverwood Solutions today as we chat a little bit more about the myths and misconceptions of manufacturing overseas and the best practices for selecting a contract manufacturer. My name is Andrew Craig. I'm on the business development team here at Indiegogo. I'm excited to be here today with Riverwood Solutions to talk a bit more about our partnership. So our main speaker today is going to be Ron Keith, the founder and senior consultant at Riverwood Solutions. But before we get started, I want to give you a little bit more context. For those of you who might be new to Indiegogo, we were actually the first crowdfunding platform to launch back in 2008. Since then, we've raised over $1 billion for people looking to fund their dreams. Technology and design is one of our core focus areas, and so far we've helped raise over $450 million for tech and design entrepreneurs, and that figure continues to grow rapidly. So this webinar is one of the first of hopefully many, where we aim to empower entrepreneurs through education and resources that go above and beyond crowdfunding. The idea here is to provide entrepreneurs with support through their whole life cycle so that they can bring products to market successfully past the crowdfunding stage. And so one of the consistent requests for support that we've received is in the manufacturing space specifically. People who've raised a lot of money themselves are in a position of needing to deliver on a lot of units of product. And so whether entrepreneurs are seasoned manufacturing experts or they're building a hardware product for the first time, they all stand to benefit from advisory and on-the-ground support when it comes to manufacturing specifically. Riverwood Solutions is one of our partners in the manufacturing and supply chain space, and they're here to talk with us a little bit about some of the best practices for entrepreneurs who are going through the process of building and executing a manufacturing strategy. And specifically, those who are just starting out and looking for a contract manufacturer overseas that fits their specific needs. As a leading managed services provider for manufacturing and supply chain, Riverwood provides support for our entrepreneurs through manufacturing processes, helping to free their capacity, uncover process efficiencies, and shorten time to market. So Riverwood have worked with a lot of different companies, large and small, from Nike with the Nike Fuel Band to small and mid-sized companies like Whistle and Eero, and of course Indiegogo campaigners like Atlas Wearables. So some of the key areas of specialty for them include support in building out or optimizing supply chains, manufacturing vendor assessment and qualification, and on-the-ground support for manufacturing. As a final note, as we go through today's webinar, please feel free to submit your questions throughout. We really want to make this a collaborative process, and we're going to try and answer as many questions as we can while you're on the line today. Please give us feedback as well. This is one of the first webinars that we're doing of this nature, and we'd love to hear what you like, what we can do better in the future, and just how we can help you as campaigners. And so with that, I'll introduce Ron Keith from Newegg to talk a little bit more about the myths and misconceptions of contract manufacturing.
Very good. Thank you very much. So a little bit more about Riverwood before I jump right in here. Riverwood and Indiegogo were founded in the same year, and the company was founded specifically to help startups and small to mid-sized companies take advantage of the newly outsourced and newly globalized world. Today, the team has about 110 people around the world. Almost half of those are in China. And what we do is we provide upfront consulting, but also ongoing managed services and execution support for a wide variety of manufactured products. To date, the company has launched some 200 different products in about a dozen different countries. So with that, let's get into the agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of selecting the right manufacturing partner and how doing your homework to find the right fit is really what is required, because there are an awful lot of manufacturing companies out there. We'll go through the top 10 myths and misconceptions that many people have in selecting a contract manufacturer. We'll talk a little bit about disappointment, how we define it and how you might avoid it. And then a little bit about what current users of contract manufacturing are disappointed by and some of the most difficult issues that we see in kind of the next step after selecting a contract manufacturer. So, it's a big wide world out there. Today, there are almost 10,000 electronic manufacturing service firms in the world. Roughly half of those are located in China. And today, about 55% of the world's electronics are actually manufactured in China. The good news here is I don't think any of you are going to need 9,600 manufacturers. You're all probably going to need one good manufacturing services firm to at least initially meet your specific demand. So the real question here that we're going to dive into a little bit today is which one? Which is the right contract manufacturer, and how do we go about selecting one contract manufacturer out of so many? So let's talk a little bit about today's users of contract manufacturing. And I will probably go back and forth quite a bit between the term contract manufacturer and EMS. EMS is kind of the upgraded term for contract manufacturer, primarily in the electronic space. So at Riverwood, we survey not only our customers, but we do broader surveys of users of contract manufacturing. From time to time, we're going to share with you some of what we found. So most OEMs that we survey are somewhat unhappy with their current contract manufacturer. And we bring that up because if we understand why people are unhappy today, hopefully we can help some of you folks not be unhappy with your contract manufacturing partner or who you choose in the future. So only about 38% of product companies are currently satisfied with their EMS provider. So the specific survey question we asked to get to this is, on a Likert scale of agree and disagree, am I satisfied with the overall value I get from my EMS provider? And so the responses break down as follows. About 38% agree with that statement, that they are satisfied, or, they strongly agree with that, they're very satisfied. But about 62% are somewhere between neutral and strongly disagreeing with that. So you can see about 2/3 of the universe is somewhere between unhappy and ambivalent towards their current manufacturing partner. And of course, if people are unhappy with their current supplier, there's quite a few people that are looking around for new ones. So 68% of current users of contract manufacturing are looking to evaluate new suppliers. So the survey question here is, do I plan to evaluate a new EMS supplier within the next 12 months? And again, it's a Likert scale where we're looking for very likely, somewhere between not very likely to extremely likely. And so the way those results came out are something like this. So about 68% are looking to evaluate a new supplier, which is very close to the number that we found that are less than thrilled with their supplier. So for a lot of established companies, looking at contract manufacturers has become almost an ongoing activity. We would suggest from our experience that if you're continuing to look for a new contract manufacturer over and over again, perhaps some of the challenge there might lie with you, might lie with the product company themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the key to finding happiness with a contract manufacturer and EMS provider. What it's really about is finding the right fit. And that fit is across multiple different dimensions. Quite often, we see startups will spend an inordinate amount of time and a lot of their energy really specifically and almost exclusively looking at the technological fit. Is this a company that has done similar types of products? Do they have the right type of engineers? Do they have the right type of capability? And certainly that is very important, but it is just one dimension of the fit that you need to find in a contract manufacturing provider. Another dimension is the business model that the supplier operates under and how that relates to what your specific business model needs are. Some people operate only on a consigned basis. Some people operate only on a turnkey basis. Some people do not do build to order high levels of customization, whereas some customers, take orders purely on a build to order basis. So making sure that the business model that the supplier is comfortable with and generally operates under is consistent with your business model needs. Yeah. Sorry, minor technical glitch there. Then, of course, there's geographic fit. One of the things we help customers do is really figure out their factor input cost and make some geographic recommendations in terms of where they should manufacture. If you're looking to manufacture in a low-cost region, looking at suppliers in upstate New York might not be the best fit for you. So understanding that early and narrowing down the scope of what you're looking at and who you're looking at. And then lastly, I would contend that this is probably the most important aspect of finding happiness in a contract manufacturing relationship, and that is finding the right cultural/relationship fit. And that's about having two companies that act in similar ways, that manage in similar ways, that respond in similar ways, so that there's not a lot of frustration in the general communication process. A lot of times cultural and relationship fit also has to do with finding a good size match. If you're planning on outsourcing $1 million or $2 million a year of production, you're probably not going to find the right fit with, a $5 or $10 billion provider. So it's important to understand this aspect as well, if not more importantly than understanding the technological fit. So as we're looking at these fits, it's important to examine the details as part of the due diligence and to actually perform a due diligence to really understand what is the capability of the supplier and what is the general conduct of the supplier. So real capabilities, are a little bit hard to suss out. Most of you are going to be seeing, slide decks mainly from salespeople, not necessarily from the people who are responsible for executing the business. And what you need to get to is determining what the supplier's real capabilities are. And understanding capabilities involves two different things. One, you need objective evidence of the capability and or the conduct. And it's interesting, we have a lot of companies that come to us and want us to help them find a supplier in Vietnam or China or Mexico. And, when we give them a quote on doing that and talk about how we do it, they go, maybe I'll just do it myself. And quite often those companies then come back to us and say, look, I've got my supplier, but things aren't going very well. And, when we dig into it, it's quite common that when they were selecting their supplier, they didn't look at objective evidence of capability. They looked at the slide deck, they talked to the people at the company, but in many, many cases, nobody, a lot of people don't actually call references of the company and current and past users of the company's services to really understand how does the company behave, are they really good at what they do, how do they conduct themselves, etc. So objective evidence is more than just the company's statements about what they do and what they're good at. And then independent validation, of their performance. What we like to do is get a couple of different references for a supplier once you start getting close. You want a strategic reference, which is, maybe the person at the OEM that's ultimately responsible for running the business. And then you want a tactical reference, someone lower level in the OEM's organization that maybe is responsible for the day-to-day and sees a different perspective. And triangulating these two perspectives can really give you an idea of how a supplier acts at all different levels. And then there's the robustness and breadth of the delivery system. If you need a special type of molding technology that gives you a very high level of finish or a very specific RF technology, it's not sufficient to ask the supplier, have you done X or have you done Y? It's more appropriate to say, tell me about what you have done in X and what you have done in Y, and how many customers and what types of volumes have you produced using this capability or this technology. It's also important to understand for mid-sized to larger companies, where is the center for them of that capability? So if you're looking at a plant in Suzhou and this company says we have great capability in this, it's important that that capability be in the area that you're looking at, outsourcing. So having great capability in Singapore does not necessarily help them execute in Suzhou. So it's also understanding the geographic location of their specific delivery systems. So what we like to say is the time to sort out the difference between the slideware and the substance is before you engage with that supplier. So you have to think about what you're really buying. You're not buying the sales pitch. You're not buying the slide deck. What you're buying is the services that are supposedly elaborated in that sales pitch. And so we like to say that, whether it's an OEM or a component supplier, or I'm sorry, a contract manufacturer or a component supplier, or almost any supplier, often what you are buying is the words, the pitch, the sizzle in what they presented to you. But once that is done, eventually you're going to end up having to get a big taste of the actual steak that you purchased. So you really want to make sure that those two things correlate very well before you engage and not be surprised afterwards. So I'm going to do a little homage here to David Letterman and talk about some of the top 10 myths and misconceptions we see about selecting a contract manufacturer. This comes from, more than a decade of Riverwood experience, probably 200 engagements of this nature. So number 10, if I select the right partner, everything will be perfect. Selecting the right partner is really important, and it's very hard to get the wrong partner to perform appropriately, but selecting the right partner is the first step, and there is a lot more to it than just getting that piece right. Number 9, I just need to find the lowest quote price. I understand that a lot of you are going to be participating in truly price competitive spaces, and I'm not here to minimize, the impact of costs on your business. But there are also people on the phone where price is probably not the primary competitive factor in whether someone buys their product. And so be aware of that. But also, more importantly, this bullet is about understanding the difference between the lowest landed cost, or the lowest total cost, and the lowest quote price. Those are not always correlated. And quite often we see specific contract manufacturers who will give you a low quote price, but then will find ways to extract additional economic benefit over time. Number 8, my board will be impressed if I sign up with a tier 1 provider. That's probably not true, although I suspect some of you on the phone are hearing this, that we'd really like to see you with one of the big global tier 1 providers. I would suggest that that is probably backwards in most cases. What you want is someone that is the right fit, and to be an incredibly small fish in an incredibly large pond very often, not always, but very often makes it difficult to get the level of attention and the level of service that you need. And so what will likely impress your board is if you produce a high quality product at a low cost on time and you meet your customers' expectations. And how you get there is really not as important as delivering that performance. Number 7, I don't want to use a contract manufacturer or an EMS that is building for my competitor. We see this all of the time. I think this is absolutely silly. The contract manufacturers are in a service business. They are not in a product business. There's, very, very low risk of, the product technology being, borrowed or, taken by the contract manufacturer. But there is a very high probability if they're building for your competitor that they are getting some additional economies of scale on similar bill of material items, that they're getting additional economies of scale on similar technologies. And so we suggest that people just kind of ignore this and, pick the right supplier without regard to if they're building for some company that you don't like. Number 6, I need a partner that is willing to invest in my business. For a lot of crowd-funded opportunities, we hear this quite a bit. We understand that, cash is very dear and many of you have only raised a certain amount of money. It's not unusual to ask your supplier for certain trade terms and things like that, but there's a difference between, getting the best terms that you can get and really looking for someone to invest by either doing things for free, or in some cases we see people taking loans from their suppliers and stuff. As a general rule, we find that good contract manufacturers make bad banks and that good banks make bad contract manufacturers. And where at all possible, it's best to keep those two things separate, because really what you want is high quality product at the right cost and the right time. And confusing that with other business conditions that are not really what the contract manufacturers focus on can kind of lead you astray. Number 5, I need the most technically competent EMS partner. Again, what you need is an appropriate level of technical competence, and it should be one of the 4 primary items that you look at. But if you try and optimize on technical competence, you're probably going to leave something else on the table. Number 4, vertical integration is critical to getting the best price and the best lead time. There are a number of suppliers, mid-sized guys up to very large players, who have embraced a strategy of vertically integrating where they can fabricate the circuit boards and they can injection mold the plastics and they can bend the sheet metal and they can stuff the board and they can wrap everything together for you. That's a viable model. It makes sense for some products. It doesn't make sense for some products. But what we typically find is vertical integration and getting the lowest price or the best price tend to be uncorrelated. And so when you're looking at slide decks from different suppliers, keep that in mind and really think about vertical integration and whether it in reality would make sense for your business or if it's for companies that are much higher volume than yourself. Number 3, in an outsourced world, R&D or product development or one of these other functions should be able to manage production, right? It's all you're doing is locating Foxconn and placing a purchase order, right? So anybody should be able to manage it. That's just very untrue. It is just so far from the way the world actually works. Manufacturing, supply chain are both, professions. And even though in an outsourced world you can manage these with a limited number of resources, that limited number tends not to be 0, and it tends not to be someone whose primary role is in a totally different, functional area. So we see best practices here as, most startups will hire someone that has the operating hat on their head, and then they can use whatever external resources or internal resources they need to, but they tend to be focused on operations. 2, larger contract manufacturers will give us a lower VAM. Typically, pricing comes to you in a couple of different ways, but at a minimum, the contract manufacturer will break down, here is what the materials I am buying on your behalf cost, and here is what my overhead, labor, and profit are. We call those VAM, or the value add piece, the non-material piece. And although it would certainly make sense that larger companies could produce for a lower VAM, it doesn't tend to be the case. And we see, great pricing disparities, relative to size. And there are a number of, $50 and $100 million suppliers that we work with that tend to be incredibly competitive on the VAM side. So don't be swayed by, bigger must be better or bigger must be cheaper. And the last one, EMS provider X had the best presentation. They're the best. Again, you're not buying the presentation. What you're buying is the capabilities underneath it. And so don't confuse marketing budget with manufacturing know-how when you're selecting a contract manufacturer. So the definition of disappointment, there are many of them, but the one we like to use is, it is a measure of the gap between execution and expectations. So how do you keep from being disappointed? Well, it involves those 2 aspects of the equation, and managing those and manipulating those, or the leverage you have over those, very closely. So obviously the first one is defining and calibrating what your expectations are. And I've been to China way too many times to count with a relatively small company that is going to be the next Apple, and not only are they espousing an expectation of, basically, free, perfect, and now, they actually in part believe some of that. And, that's a soundbite. That's not a strategy. And so if you have those types of expectations with 100% certainty, you're going to be disappointed. So understanding what you really need, what your hot buttons are, what is a nice to have and what is critical, and defining your expectations appropriately will go a long way to keep you from being disappointed. And then of course there's the part of diligently driving to the executions. So get the expectations right, and once you've calibrated those expectations, manage execution to those expectations. And so execution in an outsourced world doesn't happen on its own. You don't just go away and expect that the contract manufacturer should do things right. They have to be managed. And people that manage them actively tend to get better results than people that don't. So in our estimation, about 40% of the disappointment comes from people truly picking the wrong partner, looking at a single dimension and optimizing on that dimension, forgetting about all their other requirements, and then post facto being disappointed with the performance of their supplier. But fully 60% of it comes from managing whichever supplier you have chosen, to meet your specific expectations. And don't assume that the contract manufacturer knows what those expectations are. And certainly don't assume that the contract defines all of your expectations. I have never seen a contract that defined all of the expectations. The contract kind of defines the terms and the conditions and some basic operating parameters. But once the contract is signed, you need to sit down, put together some real rules of engagement, and talk about what you expect and at what frequency you expect it, how you will manage those expectations. So this is some more data from one of our surveys, and it's a survey of OEM users of contract manufacturers. I'm going to hit some of the high points here, mainly to demonstrate if there's a very high propensity for current users to be disappointed with these issues. There's probably a high propensity for some of the people on the phone moving forward to be disappointed with the same issues. So be aware that these are very common issues. So the number one issue is the perception or the reality that my contract manufacturer lacks proactivity in managing the materials pipeline. Look, I give them a forecast, and maybe my forecast goes up, maybe my forecast goes down, but they don't seem to have the right material, or they don't have enough of it. A lot of that depends on how you define the contractual terms and whether you're enabling them to execute to this. But, for as long as I can remember, this has been the number one issue in contract manufacturing. Number two, my contract manufacturer nickels and dimes me for every little thing. You got to get that right in the contract, but you also got to sort it out when you're picking the supplier. There are suppliers who you can tell after visiting them and talking to them and talking to their customers. There are suppliers that do this very, very frequently, and then there's suppliers who don't. And understanding the difference will help you avoid this particular source of disappointment. My supplier can't develop and execute to a delivery plan on a continuous basis or on a regular basis. Sometimes that's supplier selection. Sometimes that is the fault of the OEM, and how is data flowing and how often data flowing, and does the supplier have the same visibility you do? Are you quoting lead times that are consistent with your supply chain lead times and things like that? But again, this one usually gets back to something materials related, generally more than something capacity related. My supplier is more concerned with covering their ass than concerned with what I need. Okay, that's probably true. These are businesses. They're not here just to build your product for free, although many customers, contract manufacturers, think that they should build my specific product for free or very low margin. So of course they have their own business needs, and they have to protect themselves from certain liabilities and stuff like that. The best way to address this is having conversations around it up front, making sure that you put in place contractual terms consistent with your expectations, not contractual terms on material liability that are potentially tighter than your delivery expectations. And number five, failure to develop a self-sustaining level of product knowledge. Most of you will have this complaint regardless of what supplier you choose, because you're probably launching a fairly new, relatively novel product. It's probably a product that some of you on the phone personally designed. And so it takes a while for these suppliers to develop the level of knowledge about your product that you have. And so understanding that this is generally an issue of disappointment, the right thing to do is understand this very early and try and be proactive about how do you support this if it's going to exist, and how do you work with the supplier, collaboratively to help bring their level of product knowledge up quickly. But contract manufacturing isn't all bad. And so if we talk about some of the lower scoring items on our surveys, my contract manufacturer has no idea what they shipped me or when. We don't hear that very much. Shipping is the trigger point for getting paid, and so they tend to be on top of that, pretty well. It's impossible to get a hold of the right person. That depends on the supplier, but most suppliers really understand that there's a huge customer interface aspect to this business. And so that's not something we get a lot of complaints about, either within our customer base or when we're surveying outside of our customer base. This is one that we see a couple of times a year. It's only a 2%er, but it's a 2%er that can be fatal. And so, my CM stopped paying their suppliers, and now I'm stuck. We do see that most people that do their own selection do not do any financial feasibility or financial health measures of the supplier. And so a couple of times a year, we will have somebody call us and say, I'm sole source with supplier X. They're not building stuff because they can't pay their suppliers. They're on the verge of bankruptcy. What do I do? Again, it's a small issue, so I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep, but it's one of those issues that if it happens to you, it could be the end. So do a little due diligence on the financial health of your potential supplier. My supplier is always building at the wrong rev level. And this used to be more of a problem, maybe a 7-8% problem 10 years ago. Most suppliers, even the very small ones, have some type of PDM process, have pretty good ECO management processes. And so they understand that change management is part of the deal, and they've gotten pretty good at it. Then there's one that we hear from approximately negative 100% of our customers, which is my contract manufacturer is always lowering my price. Just don't really hear that very often. In fact, I've never heard anybody complain that the contract manufacturer is lowering my price too often. So once you've selected the contract manufacturer, sorry, got ahead of myself there. So if we refer back to myth number 10, selecting the right partner is important, but it's an absolute misconception that if you get the right partner, everything's going to be perfect. Nothing in manufacturing is ever going to be perfect. It requires work, oversight, and diligence. So this is just absolutely wrong. Once you select the right partner, your odds of success have gone up. And now you just have to figure out how to do the right things to work with that partner and manage that partner. One of the right things to do, or one of the things that kind of comes next after selecting them, is putting in place an appropriately detailed contract. And so this is a survey. This particular survey was done on the other side of the table from most people on this call. This was a survey of top contract manufacturing executives that do the negotiations with customers like the folks on the phone, and how they see the contentiousness of certain issues. So the number one is contractual cost downs. Usually startups don't get contractual cost down, but sometimes large companies can agree with a supplier that my costs will come down not less than a certain percentage per quarter or per year. But it's a contentious issue. For startups, probably the second one is most important, which is material liability. You're going to have materials that have lead times, and you're going to have a lead time on your product. And it's important that you allow your contract manufacturer to buy materials consistent with lead times that you're quoting on your product. So if you're quoting a 2-week lead time on your product and you have material in there that's got a 10-week lead time, you have to get the right contractual terms so that your supplier knows they can buy the material on your behalf without getting stiffed for it. Another big one that's really risen in the last couple of years is IP indemnification. Not just the indemnification for product stuff, but if my supplier is using a specific process, are they going to indemnify me that I won't get sued for using that process to build my product when I'm not really the person controlling the factory? So it's kind of a bilateral issue there. Then there are just performance terms that are often included in the contract that can get very contentious. Payment terms, some people expect 90-day terms. Many people can't even get 30-day terms. A lot of small suppliers want some money up front. That's always a sticking point. And then other issues like product-specific indemnifications, warranty issues, and things like that. So with that, I know I went a little bit over and we covered an awful lot of material there. I think with that, we are going to open it up for some questions. I see that quite a few questions have come in. Looks like the first question is from John. John says, can you help a creator to design this product idea and iteration and find someone to make a prototype? Yeah, that is something that Riverwood does. We work with a lot of companies at the conceptual stage. I'm not sure how much I can really elaborate it here, but you're welcome to go to our website and put in an inquiry, or even just call our office. Richard asks, do you have manufacturers that are FDA certified? So when you say FDA certified, certified is a little bit of a misleading term. So the way the FDA regulates manufacturers depends on what type of device or what type of product. And so there are different levels of surveillance and registration, and there are different levels of auditing, depending on the class of device. Also depending on whether the manufacturer uses GMP, CMGP, and if they have the appropriate ISO certifications for medical devices. The short answer, Richard, is yes. I mean, there are many suppliers, both domestically and abroad, that have FDA certification, and more we're seeing medical products built offshore, probably more so than onshore now. Andrew asks, do most contract manufacturers only work in Asia? What about other areas like South America? I like that question, Andrew. So in general, the contract manufacturing world is kind of broken down into tiers, and there are 4 tiers. And those tiers tend to be defined by revenue. So there are guys that are doing more than $5 billion a year in revenue, and there's about 8 of those guys. Then there are guys that are doing more than $1 billion and less than 5, and there are about 25 of those guys. Then there are guys doing between 500 and $1 billion, and guys doing less than 500. Obviously, when there's 9,600 companies, the vast majority of them are relatively small. And so we see kind of 3 types. We see these big global players, someone like a Foxconn, someone like a Jabil, someone like a Flextronics, that might have 30 factories in 25 countries. In Asia, we see a lot of Asia-only contract manufacturers. So maybe it's one or a company that's 600 or 700 million, and they have 3 different factories in China. So they're very China-specific or Asia-specific. Same in South America. There are local South American contract manufacturers, but then there are larger global players that have a presence in South America. Most of the tier 1 suppliers have operations at a minimum in Brazil. And we can talk more about that if you want. You can drop me an email or make an inquiry online, and I'm happy to have some conversation with you about that. Magur, I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly. I apologize if I'm not. I have a prototype functional, but non-electronics, more mechanics. Is it also you I can contact? Yes, you can contact us, and there are also a number of other companies that can help you with it. I mean, it's a lot of products that are very mechanically intensive. Most of the mechanical stuff we do is, a subcomponent of, the technology stuff we do. But we do a lot of work in plastics. We do a lot of work in, sheet metal and stuff like that. And we have an entire mechanicals team. So happy to talk to you about that. Is it an L or an I? Is that Chow? Chow's question is, can you talk a little bit about issues with manufacturing in China? We always hear that going to China is a big step and very complicated one. So unfortunately, Chow, I would agree with that. And it's one of the reasons, we actually founded Riverwood. And, I'm not here to do a sales pitch, but, I worked in and around China manufacturing for probably 15 years, prior to founding Riverwood. And it's very difficult. And what we see most people do is, I'm going to hire 3 or 4 guys in Santa Clara or San Francisco to manage China. And they don't speak the language and they don't understand the culture, might even be new to manufacturing and supply chain. And so, you're either Skyping them in the middle of their night or they're Skyping you in the middle of your night. And then you're flying over there 3 or 4 times and you're trying to, be understood and get your issues resolved. It is very challenging. And one of the reasons we have 100 people on the ground in China is, to try and make that easier. All of our people are, locals that speak the local language, that understand the local culture. It's a very difficult place. If you can master it, China is the world's factory. China's going to be the world's factory for a long time to come. It's not just a matter of them being cheap, because they're not nearly as cheap as they used to be. They produce, more engineers a semester than we produce a decade, right? And so there's just a lot of great infrastructure around, manufacturing in China. Sunny asked, or says, I'd like to hear about having multiple manufacturers for separate parts, which are then assembled on or offshore to mitigate several risks, including IP. So, Sunny, that's a long conversation. As a general rule, from probably most people on the phone, you're going to have more than one supplier. Now, the question is, you're going to have more than one supplier doing the final assembly and final integration of your product. And I would suggest that very few people on this call will need that anytime soon. But there are always subcomponents that you're going to get from other suppliers. And so the question is, how do you divide that up, and what should the strategy around that be? Some people will go to a big vertically integrated supplier and ask them to do a whole bunch of the subassembly. Some people will go out and individually find the best of breed suppliers in different categories, have them do the subassemblies, have everything come together either onshore or offshore, and be integrated in a single supplier. In terms of IP risk mitigation, it really depends on what you're trying to mitigate. And so I'd hate to speculate that about here. But yes, it's quite reasonable to have multiple manufacturers doing separate parts, provided that you kind of bring it together at some point. How are we doing on time?
We still have more time.
Oh, perfect. Vanden asks, what is the average price of outsourcing prototyping? Or can you give an example? That's really hard to address, and it depends on, what is the product we're talking about, what is the complexity of the product. As a general rule, most of the cost tends to be in the acquisition of the raw materials. And certainly buying raw materials at prototype volumes can be less than economically advantageous. But then it also depends on how much setup is required to build one or two of these types of things. For printed circuit boards, Vanden, there are pretty good models where, if you know about roughly the size and the complexity of your circuit board and the component count, you can get we can give you kind of a rough guess on what that costs. But if it's a fully integrated, finished goods, it's really, hard to say without actually seeing it. So I apologize. Is that Arlit or Arit?
I believe it's Arit.
Arit. And I apologize if I got that wrong. The question is, if volumes are less, how to get leverage and convincing power while negotiating? Getting detailed cost becomes difficult. Yeah, it does become difficult. And, there's no single, silver bullet I can give you around that. We definitely recommend that if you're starting up, you probably want to go to one of the big distributors like Arrow to get materials, because they are purchasing materials in great volume and have some flexibility around the price they pass through per volume, although they definitely have rules around that type of stuff. But I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the word leverage and convincing power. So a big part of it is that, and it's interesting. I had to truncate a couple of things out of this presentation for time's sake, but Since Apple has gotten so wildly successful over the last 5 or 6 years, we see a lot of people that come out of Apple and that, start up new products, and they go running around to China to suppliers they know and try and convince people that they're the next Apple, and often try and convince people with a stick more than a carrot that, look, I'm the next Apple, and if you don't do this, I'm going to remember it forever. And, convincing is really the right word, and finding a supplier that your product resonates with, and a supplier that can look at it and say, I need that, and it's a pretty cool product. And, the way it's put together is really consistent with what I do, and I think I'd add a lot of value. So, a lot of it is the convincing. And, when you're an entrepreneur, you're not just selling on the demand side. You're also you have to be selling on the supply side. You have to convince these suppliers that you have something. So it's a combination of partnering with someone like an Arrow that can help you with leverage, or possibly someone like a Riverwood that also has some ability to do that. But also it's selling yourself to the supply base and getting them excited about what you're doing and excited about the role they play. Pooja asks, regarding manufacturing in China, is it necessary to have someone on our team who speaks the language in order to minimize errors and build stronger relationships? So it is never a bad idea. There's a lot of academic literature around a concept called cultural distance. And it talks about how two different peoples or two different cultures, how far apart they are in terms of language and conduct and normative behaviors and decision making and things like that. China is a very, very different place. And one of the most important things in China doing business is relationship. And so it never hurts to have a local who understands the business culture, who speaks the language. Again, it's one of the reasons why we have 100 there. We assign people to startups teams so that they can kind of have that. But it really is important. And certainly, Pooja, if this is your company, I would recommend that when you're looking at suppliers, even if you hire someone to do it for you, go over there and meet the potential suppliers and have dinner with them and have a few drinks with them and start to build a relationship, because relationships are so much more important in China than they are here. Mike asks, can you talk about the enforceability of IP when contract manufacturing in China? What is a strategy for managing copycats? I can talk about that. I could talk about that for days. So what is the enforceability? I mean, we have treaties with China that give, on paper, reasonable intellectual property protection. As a general rule, China is either a little reluctant to always enforce that, or perhaps are not fully resourced to enforce that. So, one of the examples is the big night market by the main Shenzhen train station. You can be riding on the train with a bunch of Microsoft people, and as soon as you get off the train, there's a bunch of people there selling, bootleg copies of Microsoft, and everybody can see it. And so, yeah, is it a real problem? Yeah, it definitely is. In terms of the copycat thing, it happens. There are some ways to minimize it. But if it is a major concern, I wouldn't be overly worried about it from a manufacturing perspective. So if you really get a hit, you manufacturing in China might expedite the copycat process by a month or two. But, if you're someone, like a GoPro or a Fitbit, or that comes out with something that's new and really hot, it's going to be copycatted in China, whether you're building it there, or whether you're building it in Taiwan or Thailand or Vietnam or anywhere else. Arit asks, is it advisable to get 2CM contracted for production? If their MOQ is 5,000, my total pre-order is 10,000. Arit, my opinion is no. That is not a good idea. In fact, it's a really bad idea. And we have a lot of customers that do it. Let me walk you through that. So why do you want two suppliers? Well, you want two suppliers for two reasons. One, so that you have some negotiating leverage, but more importantly, probably so you have a backup plan, you have some security. And so by not combining your volumes, you know with 100% certainty that you're going to take a small economic penalty because it's easier to build 10,000 or cheaper to build 10,000 than 5. So what you're doing is you're making your life twice as complicated, and at the same time you're guaranteeing your product is going to be slightly more expensive. And so you know that there is a downside to doing this. So you're taking on a known downside to protect yourself from the possible downside of one of these suppliers goes south or have a problem or something. So we see a lot of people that think bringing up 2 is the right idea. At these kinds of volumes, I would suggest that it is definitely the wrong idea. And on this particular one, if you'd like to give me a call, I'd be happy to talk you through it. But I'd also be happy to give you some examples of people we've seen that did not listen to this, and it didn't turn out that well. I think we're getting pretty close to done here. We'll probably take a couple more. I see that Raphael has a question. What about software, AI, UI, UX, and app around the electronics? Are you supporting that too? We don't do a whole lot in app support. We do some stuff in terms of supporting, onboard software for SoCs and, firmware and things like that. We personally don't do much in application support, and there are probably, companies out there much better suited for that than say a Riverwood.
All right. And it looks like our last question here is someone had asked about the business model between Indiegogo, Riverwood Solutions, and some of our other partners. This is Andrew Craig from the business development team here at Indiegogo. I think I can speak to that one. So, what we started to do about 18 months ago was really help our campaigners think through what they can do beyond the crowdfunding stage to be successful and to make sure that they become successful businesses past crowdfunding. And so in terms of how we work with Riverwood Solutions, campaigns that raise money on the Indiegogo site, we actually introduce them to Riverwood Solutions to help them through this manufacturing process. And that's a really good, I think, place to leave off on this conversation is if you're interested in talking to Riverwood Solutions, if you're a Indiegogo campaign or or if you're otherwise interested in manufacturing services, Riverwood would like to talk to you and see what they can do to help you. So enterprise.indiegogo.com/RWS is the site that we use for our Indiegogo campaigners. That's one way to get in touch with them if you are an Indiegogo campaigner. But then, as Ron said, their doors are open, and if you want to talk with them about any questions you have about contract manufacturing or things of that nature, their doors are open.
So I hope everybody got something out of this today. I know it was a lot of material to digest relatively quickly. If you like this type of thing, if you found any of this to be helpful, please provide feedback to the folks at Indiegogo. I think they'll probably be soliciting some feedback after this. And if there are other topics that would be useful to all of you in your entrepreneurial endeavors, feel free to include that, and maybe we can do some additional, informative webinars and stuff. So thank you all very much. I know it's hard to carve out an hour in the middle of the week, but we appreciate all of you that attended.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone.